If we could go on a tangent of a tangent, since we're talking about individualism, and that's not all that it takes. You've mentioned in the past the book, The Ancient City,
Yes.
by, if I can only pronounce the name, French historian, Numa Denis Fustel de Coulon. I don't know.
That was amazing.
Okay, all right. From the 19th century. Anyway, you said this is an important book to understand who we are and where we come from.
So what that book does, it's actually quite a striking book. So that book is written by this guy, as a who's I'm going to let Lex do the pronunciations, the foreign language pronunciations for the day. He was a professor of classics at the Sorbonne in Paris, the top university in the 1860s. So actually right around after the U.S. Civil War, and he was a savant of a particular kind, which is and you can see this in the book, is he had apparently read and sort of absorbed and memorized every possible scrap of Greek and Roman literature, and so it's like a walking index on basically Greek and Roman, everything we know about Greek and Roman culture, and that's significant. The reason this matters is because basically none of that has changed, right? And so he had access to the exact same written materials that we have access to, and so there, we've learned nothing. And then specifically what he did is he talked about the Greeks and the Romans, but specifically what he did is he went back further. He reconstructed the people who came before the Greeks and the Romans and what their life and society was like. And these were the people who were now known as the Indo-Europeans. And these were, or you may have heard of these are the people who came down from the steppes. And so they came out of what's now like Eastern Europe, like around sort of the outskirts of what's now Russia. And then they sort of swept through Europe. They ultimately took over all of Europe. By the way, almost many of the ethnicities in the Americas in the hundreds of years that follow, are Indo-European. So they were this warrior class that came down and swept through and essentially populated much of the world. And there's a whole interesting saga there. But what he does, and then they from there came basically what we know as the Greeks and the Romans were kind of evolutions off of that. And so what he reconstructs is sort of what life was like, at least in the West, for people in their kind of original social state. And the significance of that is the original social state is living in the state of the absolute imperative for survival, with absolutely no technology, right? Like no modern systems, no nothing, right? You've got the clothes on your back, you've got your, you've got whatever you can build with your bare hands, right? This is, predates basically all concepts of technologies we understand them today. And so these are people under maximum levels of physical survival pressure. And so what social patterns did they evolve to be able to do that? And the social pattern basically was as follows. Is a three-part social structure, family, tribe, and city. And zero concept of individual rights, and essentially no concept of individualism. And so you were not an individual, you were a member of your family. And then a set of families would aggregate into a tribe, and then a set of tribes would aggregate into a city. And then the morality was it was actually what Nietzsche talks about. The morality was entirely master morality, not slave morality. And so in their morality, anything that was strong was good, and anything that was weak was bad. And it's very clear why that is, right? It's because strong equals good equals survive, weak equals bad equals die. And that led to what became known later as the master-slave dialectic, which is it more important for you to live on your feet as a master, even at the risk of dying, or are you willing to, live as a slave on your knees in order to not die? And this is sort of the derivation of that moral framework. Christianity later inverted that moral framework, but the original framework lasted for many, many thousands of years. No concept of individualism. The head of the family had total life and death control over the family. The head of the tribe, same thing. Head of the city, same thing. And then you were morally obligated to kill members of the other cities on contact. right? You were morally required to. If you didn't do it, you were a bad person. And then the form of the society was basically maximum fascism combined with maximum communism. Right. And so it was maximum fascism in the form of this absolute top-down control, where the head of the family, tribe, or city could kill other members of the community at any time with no repercussions at all. So maximum hierarchy, but combined with maximum communism, which is no market economy. And so everything gets shared. Right. And sort of the point of being in one of these collectives is that it's a collective and people are sharing. And of course, that limited how big they could get, because, the problem with communism is it doesn't scale. Right, it works at the level of a family. It's much harder to make it work at the level of a country. Impossible. Maximum fascism, maximum communism, and then it was all intricately tied into their religion. And their religion was it was in two parts. It was veneration of ancestors, and it was veneration of nature. And the veneration of ancestors is extremely important, because it was basically the ancestors were the people who got you to where you were. The ancestors were the people who had everything to teach you. Right. And then it was veneration of nature, because, of course, nature is the thing that's trying to kill you. And then you had your ancestor. Every family, tribe, or city had their ancestor gods, and then they had their nature gods. Okay, so fast forward to today. Like, we live in a world that is like radically different. But and the book takes you through kind of what happened from that through the Greeks and Romans through to Christianity. And so, but it's very helpful to kind of think in these terms, because the conventional view of the progress through time is that we are, the cliche is the arc of the moral universe, bends towards justice, right? Or so-called Whig history, which is, that the arc of progress is positive, right? And so we what you hear all the time, what you're taught in school and everything is, every year that goes by, we get better and better and more moral and more pure and a better version of ourselves. Our Indo-European ancestors would say, oh no, like, you people have like fallen to shit. Like, you people took all of the principles of basically your civilization and you have diluted them down to the point where they barely even matter, and you're having, children out of wedlock, and you regularly encounter people of other cities and you don't try to kill them. And like, how crazy is that? And they would basically consider us to be living like an incredibly diluted version of this sort of highly religious, highly cult-like, right, highly organized, highly fascist communist society. I can't resist noting that as a consequence of basically going through all the transitions we've been through, going all the way through Christianity, coming out the other end of Christianity, Nietzsche declares God is dead. We're in a secular society, that still has, tinges of Christianity, but, largely prides itself on no longer being religious in that way. We being the sort of most fully evolved modern secular, expert scientists and so forth, have basically re-evolved or fallen back on the exact same religious structure that the Indo-Europeans had, specifically ancestor worship, which is identity politics, and nature worship, which is environmentalism. And so we have actually like worked our way all the way back to their cult religions without realizing it. And it just goes to show that, like, in some ways we have fallen far from the family tree, but in some cases we're exactly the same.
You kind of described this progressive idea of wokeism and so on as worshiping ancestors.
Identity politics is worshiping ancestors, right? It's tagging newborn infants with either, benefits or responsibilities or, levels of condemnation based on who their ancestors were. The Indo-Europeans would have recognized it on sight. We somehow think it's like super socially progressive.
Yeah, and it is not.
I mean, I would say obviously not. Let's, get nuanced, which is where I think you're headed, which is, look, like, is the idea that you can like completely reinvent society every generation and have no regard whatsoever for what came before you, that seems like a really bad idea, right? That's like the Cambodians with year zero under Pol Pot, and death follows. It's obviously the Soviets tried that. The utopian fantasists who think that they can just rip up everything that came before and create something new in the human condition and human society have a very bad history of causing enormous destruction. So on the one hand, it's like, okay, there is like a deeply important role for tradition. And the way I think about that is it's the process of evolutionary learning, right? Which is what tradition ought to be, is the distilled wisdom of all. And this is how the Indo-Europeans thought about it. It should be the distilled wisdom of everybody who came before you, right? All those important and powerful lessons learned. And that's why I think it's fascinating to go back and study how these people lived, is because that's part of the history and part of the learning that got us to where we are today. Having said that, there are many cultures around the world that are, mired in tradition to the point of not being able to progress. And in fact, you might even say globally, that's the default human condition, which is, a lot of people are in societies in which, there's like absolute seniority by age. Kids are completely, like in the US, like for some reason we decided kids are in charge of everything, right? And like, they're the trendsetters and they're allowed to like set all the agendas and like set all the politics and set all the culture. And maybe that's a little bit crazy. But like in a lot of other cultures, kids have no voice at all, no role at all, because it's the old people who are in charge of everything. They're gerontocracies. And it's all a bunch of 80-year-olds running everything, which, by the way, we have a little bit of that too, right? And so what I would say is like there's a real downside. Full traditionalism is communitarianism. It's ethnic particularism. It's ethnic chauvinism. It's this incredible level of resistance to change. It just doesn't get you anywhere. Like it may be good and fine at the level of individual tribe, but it's a society living in the modern world. You can't evolve. You can't advance. You can't participate in all the good things that have happened. And so I think this is one of those things where extremeness on either side is probably a bad idea. But this needs to be approached in a sophisticated and nuanced way.